Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and the patrons over on Patreon voted for South Dakota in my Statehood video series. Since South Dakota was part of many territories throughout its pre-state history, and I have covered a couple of those already, refer back to the Minnesota video specifically to get a better view of some of the state's territorial history. If you'd like to choose the next Statehood video or animated battle map, please visit the Patreon page and join for as little as $1. Thank you all for the support, and enjoy. Native American populations thrived on the open plains of South Dakota. These groups included the Arikara, the Dakota, Yankton, and Lakota Sioux, and the Cheyenne, to name a few. In the mid-1300s, a massacre of a large village occurred near the modern-day town of Chamberlain, where nearly 500 individuals died in the attack, demonstrating the warfare that existed in the Great Plains and the large populations present prior to European settlement in the Americas. In 1743, French fur traders pushing west from the Great Lakes made contact with the Native American peoples living in modern-day South Dakota. The French capitalized on the abundance of animals in the region and set up trade networks with Native American tribes to bring in hides in exchange for goods. The area that would become South Dakota switched from Spanish to French control until 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase brought the area under the control of the United States. In August 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition entered South Dakota from the Missouri River and would spend roughly 54 days within the future state. In 1817, the American Fur Company built Fort Tecumseh on the Missouri River, but in 1832, a fur trader from St. Louis named Pierre Chateau Jr. took the area over and named it Fort Pierre. The site of the trading post gained great attention from prospective settlers to the region, and more Euro-Americans pushed into South Dakota. The U.S. Army purchased Fort Pierre in 1855 but abandoned it, moving to Fort Randall 2 years later. With the influx of Euro-Americans, the United States government stepped in to purchase land from the Sioux and other tribes in 1858, giving the United States title to the eastern section of South Dakota. In March 1861, Congress officially organized the Dakota Territory from pieces of the Nebraska Territory and other organized territories, incorporating parts of the future states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. In 1862, during the throes of the American Civil War, tensions erupted between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in the Dakota Territory. It broke out into what's called the Dakota War, stemming from late annuity payments from the U.S. government to the Dakota, bad crop yields leading to starvation, and encroachment tensions. By the end of the war, hundreds, maybe even more, were dead on each side, and over 300 Dakota were arrested and sentenced to death. Abraham Lincoln looked over the charges and lowered that number to 39, who were hung on December 26, 1862. In 1863, the Idaho Territory split off from the Dakota Territory, taking the future state of Montana with it, but in just a year, Montana became its own territory. The territorial politics became so heated in the Dakota Territory that Congress threatened to annex the Dakota Territory to Nebraska to be done with it. This may have scared politicians who aspired to be officials in the territory, but it did not stop the battles over supremacy in the state. During this time and into the 1870s, South Dakota reaped great benefits from the gold mines established in Montana. Steamboat travel up the Missouri River brought people and goods to the territory and kept its population steadily growing. On the far western end of the Dakota Territory sat the Black Hills, considered sacred ground to the Sioux. In the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, the United States government set up a reservation incorporating the Black Hills. However, this sectioning off of land from white settlement only whetted the appetite for mining exploration in the area. The United States Army attempted to turn back any group with the intention of settling or mining the reservation. Charles Collins, an Irish-American newspaper editor, organized the Black Hills Mining and Exploration Association in February 1872. Commander of the district, Winfield Scott Hancock, ordered the organization abandoned in one of his many actions to put a stop to settlement of the reservation. By 1874, Hancock did not preside over the region. Major General Philip Sheridan grew progressively concerned over the increase in non-reservation Native Americans and thought the solution lied in the establishment of a large military outpost in the Black Hills. This led to a large expedition starting from Fort Abraham Lincoln in July 1874 to reconnoiter the area, led by George Armstrong Custer. The cavalcade consisted of 10 companies of the 7th Cavalry, 2 companies of infantry, a detachment of Indian scouts, a corps of scientists, together with newspaper correspondents, a photographer, a few miners, and numerous civilian employees. There were 110 wagons, each drawn by 6 mules, and some ambulances. This was one of the largest, most complete, and best equipped expeditions ever launched on the frontier in time of peace. There was even a band. The miners found trace amounts of gold, and word spread quickly. Prospectors, upon receiving the news, began formulating plans for the layout of mining operations. Sheridan insisted that no white trespassers were to be permitted in the Black Hills, but the growing number of gold seekers would ultimately win out. When negotiations with the Native American tribes over the Black Hills broke down, the Great Sioux War erupted, resulting in many skirmishes and battles, but none more famous than the Battle of the Little Bighorn. With the tribes driven from the Black Hills, white settlement exploded across the entire territory. Between 1870 and 1880, the population grew over 1,000%, from a little over 14,000 in 1870 to nearly 160,000 in 1880. By the early 1880s, residents of the Dakota Territory felt the statehood debate beginning to shift in their direction. Governor Ordway, the 7th Territorial Governor of the Dakota Territory, presided over a session of the legislature to remove the capital from Yankton to another location, presumably more centrally located. The Northern Pacific Railway, running through what is now North Dakota, started to give the northern section of the territory more power with the influx of people to that area. Ordway also began having problems with the power brokers in Yankton, and it is presumed that this facilitated the removal of the capital from Yankton. After multiple votes on which city should become the capital, Bismarck in the northern half got the needed amount of votes. This change in the capital also altered how the territory thought of its future statehood. As long as the capital remained in Yankton, the Northerners favored the idea of splitting the territory in half, with the southern portion becoming a state and the northern section left to remain a territory until agreed to by Congress. Now that Bismarck was the capital, Northerners favored a single state, while the Southerners favored division. The push for statehood came about in 1879, with the Territorial Superintendent of Public Instruction, William H. Beadle, becoming concerned that the land set aside for schools would be taken over by squatters and speculators. Statehood gave him one way to secure those lands set aside for schools from sale to businessmen and regular citizens. In 1883, the citizens of the southern section agreed to a constitutional convention in order to apply for statehood. The convention met and agreed to the preservation of school land, but failed to agree on prohibition of alcohol. Nevertheless, the Constitution passed. It was submitted to Congress, where the governor's associates lobbied to keep it a territory for longer, presumably to preserve his own power. The Republican-controlled Senate approved the Constitution, but the democratically held Congress denied it because the convention met without the approval of the legislature of the Dakota Territory. Anger against Ordway hit a crescendo with accusations of corruption thrown at him, which prompted President Chester A. Arthur to not reappoint him and instead appointed Gilbert A. Pierce as Territorial Governor. During the 1885 Constitutional Convention, Hugh J. Campbell maintained that the citizens possessed an inherent right to initiate and activate a state government without waiting for an enabling act. In the general election in November, the Constitution passed and the Dakota Territory elected its own governor and a full slate of state officials. The alleged governor then selected 2 state senators to represent them as a state, without formally being recognized by Congress. So, in essence, 2 governments ran the territory, the territorial governor and legislature, and the proposed state officials voted on Election Day. When the Constitution was sent to Congress, it hit a stalemate, with Republicans wanting to give statehood to the southern portion of the territory, and Democrats wanting to bring the entire territory in as a single state. Both sides looked to how they believed each future state would vote and from which party they would send their senators and congressmen. The Republicans wanted to get 2 senators from the southern portion of the territory, and Democrats believed they had a better chance of getting Democratic senators and congressmen if the entire state was admitted. In 1886, Grover Cleveland appointed his close friend and Associate Justice of the Dakota Territorial Supreme Court, Lewis K. Church, to the governorship of the territory. The Democratic Party's civil service reform and Church's agenda to lower territorial spending led him to use his veto power freely. He vetoed the establishment of a new university and the creation of a soldiers' home in Hot Springs. The legislature made appropriations for the soldiers' home over the governor's veto. His actions angered both sides and was the reason the legislature overrode his veto on the soldiers' home. It had bipartisan support. things became so heated that Democrats worked with Republicans unsuccessfully to impeach Church. In December 1887, the Territory held a convention at Aberdeen. The two sections of the Territory, as well as the two political parties, came to some agreements. One was over the Dakota name. Each side wanted to use it when they became a state, so the southern section, which had the higher population, agreed not to monopolize the name. They also agreed to the 7th standard parallel as the boundary between the two future states. In the 1888 presidential election, Republicans won the presidency as well as many seats in Congress, which made the Democrats more conciliatory, and an omnibus bill came across the desk of the lame duck president Grover Cleveland, including the Enabling Act for the proposed states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. Even though the president signed off on the Enabling Act, the Territory still needed to adopt a constitution. They essentially kept the 1885 Constitution, but Congress did assign them the task of fixing some issues of a divided territory. They needed to include an equitable division of the territorial debt and records, plus the legislative and judicial districts needed reapportioned. They met those needs, and the southern part of the territory voted to accept the Constitution on October 1st, 1889, which included prohibition, and the Territorial Government ceased to exist on November 2nd, 1889, when President Harrison announced the admittance of the twin states of North and South Dakota.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.